if a foreign secretary is saying this is indefensible and monstrous, then the obvious immediate question is, well, what are you going to do about it then? If it's indefensible, then why are you selling them arms? Your actions are saying it's not indefensible, so therefore you are happy to tolerate the forced starvation of an entire population. You are happy to tolerate children about to die, already dying from starvation.
Yeah, I don't think such sentiment has been measured that is so extreme in modern society.
We believe we will be liberated. But there is another alternative future for us, which is we become the Native Americans of the Middle East. And as soon as he approached them, about 4 or 5 police officers jumped on him, dragged him to the ground, violently arrested him, dragged him off. And at that point, I got hold of the megaphone, said, the police are trying to provoke a scene of disorder. We're not going to let that happen. We are going to do what I said we're going to do. We are going to lay our flowers here, and then we will turn around. Which will
how much about your defense can you tell me about now?
Not a lot. There has not been a moment in British history since the suffragettes where so many people have marched for such a length of time.
And even the question itself, honestly, it's quite absurd.
Don't underestimate the capacity for people in power to tolerate utter evil. And he said, well, no, why don't you tell them to go and... You had a most absurd conversation. Why don't you tell them to go sightseeing? I said, are you insane?
Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Kareem, and today I'm honored to have in the studio Ben Jamal, who's the director of the PSC, that's the Palestine Solidarity Committee. Ben, good to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Ben has been chiefly responsible among a group of other leaders who've been sort of organizing the massive protest movement that's occurred in the streets of London for the last 19 months. He's been arrested for those troubles and charged. He's due to appear in court to defend those charges next month. We're going to speak about that, but we're also going to speak about Ben's thoughts on the media and how they've covered Palestine, on the government's response, both in the UK and globally, how governments have responded. And we're going to speak a bit about his life and his thoughts for the future of Gaza and the future of Palestinian solidarity. So it's going to be a long conversation, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. Ben, just to sort of start, we've seen in this last week, it's maybe just been longer than a week now, the UK and France and Canada have shifted their tone.
Yeah.
I've also seen, literally just in media clips, that anchors are starting to slowly hold Israel more and more accountable.
Yeah.
They kind of being slightly friendlier to Palestinian voices than they were earlier. Why do you think this is happening? Why do you think this is happening? And do you think it's meaningful in any way?
Well, I think you're definitively right. And the way I would put it is we have seen sort of cracks across the political establishment. First of all, here in the UK, but we're seeing this globally. And what I mean by that is we've had a sort of decades-long framework of support, particularly by Western governments, but by the broader political establishment, public bodies, across large sections of the media, that is supportive to Israel, that has always framed what's happening within a framework of Israel being a liberal democracy, that when it's killing Palestinians in large numbers, the framework is always it's responding to what's happened. And criticism tends to be limited to the most egregious acts. We start to get, after a while, we had this in 2014, when Israel killed 2,000 Palestinians in 50 days. Towards the end of that period, people started to be, across the political establishment, queasy, and then we had narratives of sort of proportionality. But this feels different, and I think there are two things that are causing this. One is the transparent, egregious and grotesque nature of what Israel's doing. That should have been apparent from the very beginning. The rhetoric from point A, within days of October the 7th, we had Israeli ministers, the defense minister, the president, talking about destroying the whole of Gaza, talking about imposing a full blockade on Gaza, using language like "we will destroy everything." All of the sort of statements that ended up as part of South Africa's case towards the ICJ that this was genocidal on the basis of statements of genocidal intent. So that was sort of very clear early on. Then, of course, we've seen absolute devastation, both in terms of the numbers of Palestinians killed. We don't have an accurate count. We know it's well over 60,000. The amount of children being killed, the clear evidence of the amount of civilians being killed, the clear evidence of targeting of hospitals, devastation of housing stock, over 90% of housing in Gaza destroyed. So this is very, very clear what was unfolding. And that should have been enough to lead to a shift. But really what I think has shifted is since Israel effectively tore up the ceasefire agreement in front of the world in March and then imposed and made clear what it was doing. No food, no water, no supplies will enter Gaza. The consequences of that in terms of the images now and the grotesque tapestry of statistics that we're receiving. 70,000 Palestinian children being treated for acute malnutrition, the majority of them aged between 1 month and 2 years, so not really children, babies, infants. The images that people are seeing of children with distended bellies. And then the language, the clear genocidal rhetoric. Smotrich was probably the clearest example a couple of weeks ago when he said we'll destroy everything left in Gaza and drive the Palestinians out. That becomes sort of untenable to sustain this. So I think what's happening, and if you want a sort of clarity, there were two moments for me, if we're looking at the wider political establishment, that spoke to the dynamic going on. One was Alistair Campbell on his podcast, talking about the image of a Palestinian girl, I think she was about age 6, looking at a photograph of herself on her phone when she was healthy, but the image of how she is now is an emaciated child. And he said, I don't want to keep looking at pictures like this. This is intolerable. And the other was Ian Dale, berating a member of the Israeli government, the political journalist Ian Dale, saying, I've supported you for years. I've always defended Israel. You're hanging me out to dry. And so that sort of speaks to something becoming intolerable, but also people feeling, I'm complicit with this. I'm held accountable for this. This is clearly monstrous. The other thing, though, is the pressure that's been built. And some of that is pressure that's come from the solidarity movement, the amount of people that have demonstrated, the consensus across civil society that's built up, every reputable human rights agency in the world condemning what's happening in very stark language. So I think that's the reason for the shift. And we've seen this in all sorts of ways. Obviously, we saw the Foreign Secretary coming to Parliament and using very different rhetoric, saying that what Israel was doing was intolerable, unacceptable, that the statements of Smotrich were monstrous and indefensible. We've seen the Prime Minister of Slovenia get up in the European Parliament calling for a full arms embargo. We've seen the statements by, the German Chancellor, which are
that's very surprising.
Really surprising, given Germany's history of, for all sorts of reasons, of continuous and wholehearted support for Israel. But our position on this is these things are significant because actually what we believe needs to happen, which is a fundamental change of policy, it is the arguments that we have been making ring even more clearly. If a foreign secretary is saying this is indefensible and monstrous, then the obvious immediate question is, well, what are you going to do about it then? If it's indefensible, then why are you selling them arms? If it's indefensible and intolerable, why a few hours after you get up in the House of Commons and make those statements, do you authorise a British spy plane taking off from a base in Cyprus to fly over Gaza to give intelligence to the Israeli military to better target its attacks? Your actions are saying it's not indefensible, so therefore you are happy to tolerate the forced starvation of an entire population. You are happy to tolerate children about to die, already dying from starvation. So it is significant, but of course the reality is, have we seen those shifts that we're demanding? And we're going back. Thousands of people will be outside Parliament for the first Prime Minister's questions after the recess next Wednesday, demanding real action, sanctions and an immediate arms embargo. So yes, it's significant. Something is shifting. Israel is becoming increasingly isolated. But none of that matters. You know, one of the things that Smotrich said and Netanyahu reinforced is the world is allowing us to do this. So they're not going to be bothered by rhetoric. They would be bothered if Western states started to cut off the supply of weapons, if Western states said we're not going to trade with you, if public bodies in the UK said we're going to completely divest, you know, if the UN took action to say, well, let's question your right to continue to be a member of this organisation whilst you commit continually the most egregious violations of all of the rules of international law, those would have an impact. But until we see actions like that, it's not going to shift. But those who want to continue to defend not taking action are in a more difficult place once they've made the sort of statements that they've made.
Okay, so I mean, you've spoken a lot there, and I mean, you're right. A lot of it is performative because there hasn't been enough action, and the words are definitely like way too late, just in terms of being able to roll back the genocide, roll back the destruction. 90% of homes. I mean, I think people living in Gaza are going to have acute malnutrition, and it's going to impact their growth, their ability to think, create for a very long time. I mean, effectively, Palestinian society in Gaza has been destroyed, and to rebuild will be it's unfathomable. How is this going to occur? I mean, it's a bit outside of the scope of what I wanted to speak to you specifically about, but it definitely seems like a lot of this is also just, it's weird and looks like a bit of psychological hand washing, because like you mentioned, they've been saying this from day one. They've been bombing people since day one. They've been burning people alive since day one. And now obviously the pictures of starvation and children seem to have hit a nerve, which I find strange, given that all the other pictures, which were just as bad, just as grotesque, didn't. There's also, I mean, what is interesting for me is you mentioned Alistair Campbell and the interview, and I'm a South African, and so a few weeks ago, Cyril Ramaphosa went to the White House. He was summoned by Donald Trump, and a journalist asked about the ICJ case, and Donald Trump said, "I'm not here to talk about this," and then he went on about his white genocide stuff, which is a bunch of misinformation, but less significant than the ICJ case. By a big order of magnitude, I'm sure even the president of South Africa was very relieved, because he would have looked very embarrassed if Trump did come hard on him for that. And that happened just after a visit to the Gulf, and I'm not a fan of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and how they've continued to act in this situation. But do you think that may have been linked in some way? There may have been utterances on the side saying, listen, this is really getting out of hand and we need something from you? Or do you think that's just coincidental?
I mean, who knows? And I share your implied views about the actions of the leaders of the Gulf state across a whole range of measures, you know, how they run their own societies, but their complete failure over many, many years to apply the sort of pressure that they could apply. Who knows what's happening behind the scenes? I mean, there were very limited statements made during those visits, but it was significant and people noted it. If we're looking at the shifts across the political establishment, we've not seen the same significant degree of shift in public rhetoric from the US administration, I would say, but we have seen a definite shift in tone, and it was relevant, I think, that, you know, there is language around deals with Iran, obviously a deal in relation to the Houthis, and without involving Israel.
And a ceasefire.
And also a very overt decision not to visit Israel in relation to that. So that all of those are sort of giving an indication that even in the US administration, there's a lack of patience with what's going on. But we're not seeing, again, a significant shift in policy. But all of these speak to, so to me, when you're asking the question, do these things matter? And I've heard people say, no, none of these matter. If there's not a change in action, if there's not a shift in policy, then these things don't matter. But these things don't, what you've got to look at in the longer term are these moments where you see things starting to shift in terms of a framework, in terms of the mood music, And then in terms of concrete measures, which are more important to me, where we see Israel starting to get isolated. So again, if we look at the UK context, outside of the sort of political establishment in terms of the position of the government, the rhetoric across the media, we see significant developments. We've been running campaigns, for example, for some years now to try to get local authorities to divest. So, local councils across the UK hold £12 billion worth of investments through their pension funds in companies that are complicit in Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, complicit through supporting the infrastructure of illegal settlements, through supplying weapons. All of these, we've got very clear evidence of their levels of complicity. And we've been campaigning for a very, very long period of time for these local authorities to divest. And they found all sorts of reasons not to. Now, in 7 or 8 months, we've had 10 councils make commitments to divest. Now, some of those need to actually now see those through. But that, again, is a shift. What's that about? And it's about a recognition that in some of the areas where we're campaigning, they're worried about how will this impact in terms of getting re-elected as a councillor. It is clear, we're getting indications, that people are starting to look at the financial consequences. They're looking at Israel and saying, is this a place where we still want to be tied to? What are the wider consequences of this? So these are sort of shifts. And then we saw, again last week, the members of the co-op pass a motion by 70% that the co-op should no longer stock Israeli goods. Now that has to be implemented. And we expect now a battle over all sorts of pressure on the board not to implement it. But they're in a difficult place. 70%, overwhelming, of their members have said, this is what we want you to do. And if that happened, again, that's another significant sort of milestone in a major British supermarket saying, actually, we don't want to continue to treat Israel as a normal state. Now, part of our argument, of course, we talked about why has it taken so long in the last 20 months. It was obvious from within a matter of days what Israel, none of us probably would envisage the sheer scale of this, but it was very clear what their intention was, and we knew that thousands and thousands of Palestinians were going to be slaughtered and that the majority of them would be civilians, and because of the population in Gaza, at least half of them would be children. But part of what we were saying at the time is that, history didn't begin on October the 7th. This genocide that Israel has unleashed is built on the foundations of over 70 years of oppression of the Palestinian people through what we for decades, Palestinians for decades, but now a consensus across international civil society saying is a system of apartheid across all of historic Palestine, whether it applies to Palestinians who are living under military occupation or Palestinians who are citizens of the state. They all live under effectively one regime that says you don't have rights. Your rights are denied in different ways, whether you're under military occupation, you're a citizen of the state, but you are effectively second class. You're an underling in this place. And so for decades it's been clear what is the foundation of this, what type of state is this? And it should have been treated like South Africa was treated, although you don't need me to tell you, it took a very, very long time for many Western governments, including our own, to confront the reality of what South Africa was. It was only towards the very end that the British government finally said, okay, we don't want to have business as usual with this state, right towards the end.
I think the South African example is brought up a lot, and I think the fundamental thing that people don't understand is it was a lot less sustainable because the population of white people who had come to South Africa had done so 200 years ago. It wasn't continuously sustained by arrival of settlers, and it wasn't continually sustained by refugees having to leave the country. The black people were uprooted from various parts of South Africa, not allowed to own land, but they were still in South Africa. They weren't going somewhere else. And so there was this massive demographic shift. And then, the sanctions and the Cold War and a bunch of other things. And so I think it's... And yes, the South African government at no point in its entire history had the support from the UK and the US that Israel has at its lowest point. So Israel's lowest point of support does not equal to the South African government's highest point of support. And this is a fundamental thing. Just in terms of the shift, because it's so easy to be cynical about this lip service, right? Yeah. But I think I'm going to try not to be. No. And if we go back to when you were arrested in February, at the time, the things that were being saying said about never mind Palestinians and Hamas, but about protesters who were protesting against a genocide. There was a very different mood, and I think it was also when Mahmoud Khalil in the US was being arrested. All of these things were kind of happening at the same time. I want to just unpack what did you sort of notice in the sort of the weeks before that? What have you witnessed since? And also, what was your arrest all about? Like, just run me through that.
Yeah, I mean, well, the context on that. So, what I would characterize as a sort of, demonization of anybody who's active in solidarity with the Palestinian people is familiar to anyone who's been in that position, and it's global. It's been ramped up, I would say. If you wanted to put a timeline, it's always been there. But the last 15 years or so, and particularly I think since Israel began to be very concerned about shifts in global public opinion, and then the growth, of support for the Palestinian call for BDS. So you had, 2010, an Israeli think tank identify the solidarity movement and support for BDS as the major strategic threat to Israel. In 2012, Netanyahu made a speech where he said, "This is our, we risk becoming isolated in the way that South Africa was. So we need to take this seriously." And so there was a sort of strategy to how do we deal with this? And the strategy was outlined. We're going to demonize these people. We're going to separate them from the rest of sort of progressive causes, and do it largely through two sort of narratives. One of anti-Semitism. These people are calling for these things, calling for boycott because they just hate Jewish people, So Israel is the Jew amongst nations. It's a new form of the old virus of anti-Semitism. And the second, by labeling people as terrorists. There was a report produced by the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs called Terrorists in Suits 5 or 6 years ago. Had a whole chapter on my organisation with completely spurious allegations about links to terrorism, etc. So these narratives are very, very familiar. And through that lens then, when you're protesting, you're a threat to public order. That's been on steroids since we began the protests.
Since the very beginning, or did it kind of
ramp
ramp up?
Yeah, almost, right from the start, from our first protest. So the first march took place a week after October the 7th. And from then, from that very first march, there were sort of narratives trying to demonize the people marching. And then that got really ramped up. I think the high point in some ways, before we got to January the 18th,
yes,
when I was charged, etc., was in November, when we were marching on November the 11th.
So this is November 2023 or 2024?
November 2023.
Okay.
And we had a whole series of really spurious arguments that this was a unique thing, that marching on the Saturday before Remembrance Sunday had never happened in British history. This was grotesque, that we were planning to desecrate the cenotaph. And that attached to, these are Islamists marching through the streets. These are people who are, all supporters of Hamas. And these are
anti-Semites.
Making the streets unsafe. Jewish people are unable to go into London. All ignoring, for example, what were we saying, what were we doing? Ignoring in relation to this nonsense about November the 11th, as we pointed out, that apart from during COVID, there had been a march. Some organisation or other had marched on the Saturday before Remembrance Sunday on every single year, most notoriously 2018, a massive pro-Brexit march attended by numerous Tory MPs, etc., that took place just a few hundred yards from the cenotaph the day before Remembrance Sunday. So this was entirely sort of spurious, but with calls for us to be banned. Home Secretary putting pressure on the police saying you should be banning these marches. So we've had this from the very, very sort of start, this attempt to sort of demonise. The other thing it's ignored, the argument about anti-Semitism, and this has always been a feature of the Solidarity movement, is a significant number of Jewish people who belong to the Solidarity movement. On the marches, there's always a very organised bloc, people who march very overtly wanting to say we are Jewish people marching. They carry a big banner. They're represented by a range of different groups. They're always several hundred, sometimes several thousand strong at every march. So this idea that Jewish people can't come anywhere near these marches, participate, or are unsafe is transparently not true. So we've had all of this, and in a way, on one level, it hasn't worked because, what's the attempt to do there? To find grounds to try to ban the marches or to intimidate people, to make them feel that they can't come. And what we've seen as part of that tactic is a ramping up of sort of repressive measures by the police. By their own admission, they said they've used the powers that were given to them under really pernicious legislation, the Public Order Act, that gives the police the power to impose conditions on a march if they think it might cause serious disruption to the community. And they have routinely imposed those on every single march, creating obstacles for us, creating hindrances or messaging that suggests the people coming on these marches are engaged in some sort of criminal activity that requires the police to put these very special conditions on. So to give you an example of the type of thing I'm talking about, we had a condition imposed on us on the Friday evening before one of the marches. This was quite early on, I think November or December. That anybody, so we put out an assembly time, be there by 12 o'clock, and normally people assemble, you wait an hour or so for people to get there, and then you march. And they put an order saying anybody who attended before 12 o'clock would be in violation of this condition and therefore committing a criminal offence. Now, I had to ring the Gold Commander on Friday evening saying, you know how these marches work. I have hundreds of people getting there at 9 o'clock. My whole staff team and volunteers, stewards, it's a big operation. We got 500,000 people coming. You're going to arrest them all. And he said, well, no. I said, well, that's what your order says. What about people who come in coaches? There's people coming from Scotland, from Newcastle. They're not going to be able to time it perfectly. They'll time it to deal with traffic. What if they get there early? And they get off their coach? You're going to arrest them all? And he said, well, no, why don't you tell them to go and... We had a most absurd conversation. Why don't you tell them to go sightseeing? I said, are you insane? They're coming to protest peacefully. Why should they not be allowed to be where they're going to protest before the assembly time if they get there early? Now, in the end, what we saw was the police didn't employ those because it would never have stood up in the courts, but it's designed to intimidate. It's designed to give a message. The other thing we saw routinely is the police giving a running update on Twitter of how many people they'd arrested. Now, it was always a handful of people. We've had crowds of up to 1 million. And average 5 to 10 people being arrested, but they give a constant running update. And again, I've said, you don't do that at a football match. You're arresting more people at football matches. You don't say, we're at Arsenal today, update, a man's been arrested, so that you're giving people an impression there's a major criminal endeavour going on at this football ground. And so this is all this is about political pressure on the police and their response to it. It fundamentally shifted, though, leading up to January. And what was
January this year?
January 2025. We planned to march initially from the BBC. We wanted to assemble at the BBC. It's a route we use quite often, but actually in this series of marches since October, we'd only used it twice. But also we wanted to go back to the BBC because we wanted to make the point about the BBC's complicity, the bias in its reporting. And this was getting more and more attention, justifiably. Owen Jones had produced a report identifying concerns from BBC's own staff about the bias of their reporting. The police initially agreed the date for our march, and then they made it very, very clear that they had been lobbied by a variety of organisations, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Jewish Leadership Council, Community Security Trust, on the basis that close to the BBC, about 10 minutes away from where we would assemble at the BBC, is a synagogue tucked away on a side street, and this would be harassing to people in the synagogue. Now, we said, well, what evidence is there of harassment? Nobody's going to go near this synagogue. Didn't even know it was there. But what's the evidence? Have you got evidence that the 2 previous times we've assembled here, people have been harassed, been intimidated, been threatened? There was none of that. They said we don't need to have that. If they say they feel harassed, they feel harassed, which is a ridiculous standard to sort of employ. You know, I used maybe facetiously. I said, look, I'm a Republican. If I said to you when the King parades through London with his golden carriage, it harasses me, could you stop him? Would you take me seriously? Of course you wouldn't. You know, you'd say you have a political opposition to what he's doing. It doesn't justify you stopping it happening. So what then happened, and the argument was, well, you're going to be assembling at the time there's this synagogue service. We said there's no grounds for this argument, but fine, you know what? It doesn't make any difference to us. We'll go the other way. We'll go from Whitehall to the BBC. Because the point of this is we want to incorporate the BBC. We don't care whether we rally at the BBC, we rally at Whitehall. And that meant we wouldn't arrive at the BBC till 3 o'clock. The synagogue service they were talking about was going to finish at 1 o'clock. We said, by what stretch of the imagination is that harassing anybody? Nobody's going to be in the synagogue, even though we don't accept the argument at all. It's a pernicious argument. And actually it's an argument that tries to tie the whole Jewish community to support for Israel, despite, as I said, the fact there were going to be numerous Jewish people marching with us. And then that was not acceptable either, that it would be harassing to be there at any time on a Saturday, and then all sorts of other spurious arguments that this would disrupt people's right to park near the place. I said, well, that's an argument that we can't march anywhere in London, you know. So what happened in the end was we were denied the right to march either way. They put conditions that prevented that, which meant if we'd marched, every single person marching would have been arrested and charged. What we decided to do, we assembled at Whitehall, we held a rally at Whitehall, and then on the day I announced from the stage that a delegation of about 25 leaders of the movement, trade union leaders, some prominent actors, politicians, and the leaders of all of the organisations would walk as a delegation towards the BBC. I said we will carry flowers, which we intend to lay at the BBC to mark the impact of their complicity in Palestinian lives. You know, because of what they're doing, their failure to report, they are accountable for that, and that reduces the political pressure for this to end. It makes them complicit. If we get stopped by the police, which I anticipate we will be, then we'll lay the flowers at the feet of the police to mark their complicity. We got to the top of Whitehall where there was a line of police, and to our surprise, what the police did was physically beckon us through and say, please walk through, please walk through.
So 25 of you.
Yeah. Some of the crowd followed us. I'd said to the crowd, please part and allow us through, but some followed. And then we got to a second line of the police where they stopped us. I said, we want to go to the BBC. They said, you can't. I said, can I formally request that a delegation, this was myself and John McDonnell MP, can we formally request that 25 of us be allowed to walk to the BBC? And he said, well, I don't know about that. I'm going to have to pass that upstairs. So we waited. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, they beckoned Chris Nynham from Stop the War Over. So we thought, okay, we're going to get an answer. And as soon as he approached them, about 4 or 5 police officers jumped on him, dragged him to the ground, violently arrested him, dragged him off. And at that point, I got hold of the megaphone, because you can imagine the agitation in the crowd and fear. People were really frightened, what's happening. And I said, the police are trying to provoke a scene of disorder. We're not going to let that happen. We are going to do what I said we're going to do. We are going to lay our flowers here, and then we will turn around, which is what everybody did. And then the next day, I got a letter in the post, invite me into the police station, and I've been charged with inciting people to violate an order not to go towards the BBC, not to leave Whitehall, and doing it myself. So it's entirely spurious. But what was clear to me and what I said at the time, and I hold to, is I think what was the intention that day from the police was to have the highest level of arrest they possibly could, to try to provoke scenes of disorder. We were informed on the day by a member of the ambulance service that they had been told all week. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I don't have any reason to doubt it. There's no reason for someone to come and give me this information. To make sure there was adequate hospital bed space in London and enough ambulances, because they were expecting that they would need ambulances because of the protest. The police, and remember, as I said, up to that point we'd had a maximum, I think, of about 12 arrests.
Throughout the whole...
at any demonstration. Yes. Brought several coaches, empty coaches, to take people away that they were planning to arrest. And from the very beginning, we were getting all sorts of stories of people being summarily sort of arrested. The deputy leader of the Green Party told us he'd had to intervene. He's publicly spoken about this, outside of Westminster Tube Station with an old woman who was being threatened with arrest because she was waiting to go to the toilet. And they were telling her, the orders that have been imposed only allow you to assemble on Whitehall. You're not on Whitehall, therefore you're violating the orders. She said, I'm trying to go to the toilet. So we have this extraordinary situation. And in the end, that day, 77 people got arrested. But what I think was intended was that they would provoke us, that there would be a scene of mass disorder that would allow ideally, I think, probably they were hoping there would be some violence, that would give the grounds to arrest lots of people, and then the Home Secretary could come into Parliament on the Monday and say, we now need to impose new conditions on these marches to prevent them happening. It didn't happen, and it didn't happen because of the extraordinary discipline of this movement. People knew what was happening. They knew what they were there for. They knew that they are there as an anti-racist movement protesting against the genocide, and they were not going to allow the police to try to frame it as something else. But now we have to confront, I'm due in court in July, as is Chris Niner, and we will vigorously contest those charges. But we know this is not unique. We've seen numerous examples in the last 20 months in particular of extraordinary powers being used. There are people who are undertaking direct forms of actions against arms factories, who are being arrested under counter-terrorism legislation. We've seen journalists arrested under counter-terrorism legislation. We had this week powers being used that are anti-trade union powers to try to prevent pickets being used against Palestine protesters who were turning up to protest the filming of a film in London that included Gal Gadot. And the reason why is that she has been a loud advocate for Israel's actions, is an ambassador of the Israeli state, I think formally, and therefore it's absolutely legitimate to say she should be protested. And we had, I think, 5 people arrested for trying to prevent other people going about their legal business. Were they physically interacting? Were they getting in their way? Were they doing anything violent? No, they were standing there with megaphones protesting. And 5 of them were arrested. So this is the sort of climate we're seeing in terms of the attempts to repress. But part of its intent is to make people fearful, create a chilling effect. After 20 months, our last demonstration, which was on May the 17th, we had 500,000 people on the streets of London. So it's not working in terms of giving people a message, I better not turn up to these events because of the repressive environment.
My next question was going to be, how do you think these arrests and intimidation has impacted the movement? And you've kind of answered it with the May 17 turnout.
Yeah.
But have you been able to protest in significant amounts outside the BBC since then, or go to the BBC?
We've not been able to go back on a Saturday.
Right.
We have had a protest outside the BBC elsewhere. It's not a situation that we think is acceptable, because effectively, and I said this at the time to the police, and I've said it publicly, the effect of the actions of the police is to say, you can go to the BBC and protest on a Saturday on any cause you like, except for in support of Palestinian rights. And you cannot go to the BBC and protest on a Saturday in support of Palestinian rights, because that would be harassing and distressing to people trying to attend a synagogue 10 minutes away from there.
So this is very strange, because I'm pretty sure there's other parts where people have protested for various reasons connected to Palestine.
Yeah.
not necessarily organized by the PSC, which is in some vicinity of some synagogues somewhere in London.
And look, part of our defence of this case, without going into detail, we'll test how these rules have been applied. So our first ability in a legal context to test the legality of those orders will come when my trial happens and Chris Ninam's trial happens in July. And we will
how much about your defence can you tell me about now?
Not a lot. Probably as much as I've told you. But look, we will be mounting it partly. I'd say this on the basis of the evidence that's publicly available. What I just described to you of what happened when we got to the police line and what happened to the second line was widely filmed. There were lots and lots of people filming. So on film are the police saying, please walk through, please walk through. So there's a very strong argument that we were invited to walk across that police line by the police.
Okay. So there's a few things which I just want to kind of unpack that you mentioned. So the first is when these protests started, it was a Tory government which was running the place, and now it's Keir Starmer, and so January is under Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
The second is I want to ask about sustainability, and I think the most honest, just my own analysis, and I could be wrong, is but Israel's actions sustain this movement probably primarily, right? Because more than anything else, because obviously there's a lot of clampdowns and difficulties and challenges put by protesters. I mean, just coming down every Saturday, every second Saturday, or for the big ones, people coming from different towns. It's difficult in itself. It costs money, it costs time, it costs family commitments, etc. But just so given all of that, and obviously I think the primary answer is Israel sustains this by their horrendous actions. But how have you, from an organizational perspective, managed to sustain this movement? It has been, and I know this is not reported often in the media, but it has been extraordinarily peaceful. When you consider all the challenges involved, the numbers involved, how have you managed to manage all of that logistically and philosophically and organizationally in every other way? How have you managed to do that?
Well, you're right in the first place, and I often get, I used to get this in the first 6 months or so, regularly thrown at me in hostile media interviews. Why are you continuing to protest? You've made your point. Why are people still protesting? You've said what you have to say. And the answer is because the genocide is continuing, So you're right. What sustains people is that it hasn't stopped. And, if it's possible to make a genocide worse, that's what's been happening. So that's the first thing. But the other thing I think probably comes to, and part of what we do is look at all of those things that you said that impact on people, the challenges of continuing to protest, the time, the money it costs. Every time, for example, I'll use as one example Newcastle. There's coaches that regularly come down from Newcastle. They fill a coach. It costs them about £2,000 to come down. So you take all of that into account in terms of how often do you ask people to do this. But one of the other things that I suppose part of your question is, what's the purpose of this? What's the effect of it, and people's understanding of that? So
I think that it would be interesting to know that, but it wasn't actually the purpose of it. I just actually want to know, how do you logistically figure this out?
Well, how do we do it?
It seems like a very difficult thing to achieve. It is,
yes. But maybe the way I'll answer it speaks to both, to what you wanted to ask me and what I wanted to say, which is, because part of this, we're not naive, and sometimes the characterization of my organisation is, PSC is the organisation that organises these big protests. And we say, that's true. But we would be stupid, and we wouldn't have studied history if we thought, you know what, the way you change things is you just march. Anybody who thinks that wasn't around during the Iraq War demonstrations. So our view is that actually there is a purpose to the marches. They are about showing the size of the movement, the visibility. They are a body of pressure. And the government's not stupid. There has not been a moment in British history since the suffragettes where so many people have marched for such a length of time. But what I say and what people get from this and the way we have to organise these to achieve this, I've described this as a community of resistance. And part of that is when people come, I've had so many people say to me, this is the place at the moment where I feel sanity, because I cannot believe what's happening. I can't believe it's still supported. And actually, this makes me feel I'm going crazy, you know. And I come here and I see so many people that feel the same. So people feel galvanized and supported. But the key thing we want is that you come to these marches, they have their own impact, but you are then going away and you are taking something back into your towns and cities, and you're then engaged in this sort of campaigns. And my organisation's got 100 branches around the country. And so what we say is, what will build real pressure is what I've talked about. If you can get your local council to divest, it's going to have a material impact. That actually, if councils and public bodies and universities, there's campaigns going on which we're supporting across universities saying, we'll no longer divest. Same sort of tactics used by the Solidarity movement, anti-apartheid movement against South Africa. Economically isolate. If the companies that are supporting this directly, Barclays Bank, one of our major targets, are put under consistent pressure. So regularly, we've got activists who are outside Barclays Bank, picketing it, calling for people no longer to bank there. If Barclays are sponsoring an event, Wimbledon, whatever, we will go there and we will protest that event. Campaign outside supermarkets regularly, calling on them to stop stocking Israeli goods. So there are these pressure points everywhere. So part of your question, how do you sustain it, is through, you know, we use the marches to bring people to these other actions. The effort is huge. You're right. So part of your question, how do you do it? It's a major logistical exercise. It costs money. We have to raise the money, and we do that through individual donations. But what sustains it, I think, is the energy that people bring. But part of that is, and the amount of people now, I go around the country speaking to our branches, and people say to me, I've got involved, but what got me involved, I went to one of the marches. And that inspired me to think I need to do more, and then I come back and I get involved in the campaigns that are happening in sort of towns and cities. But it's a huge effort. The other thing I'll say, because part of maybe the implication is, how do you sustain this because of the energy involved? And I said something about this on May the 17th in my speech, because I could feel it. And I said, look, we're all weary. I'm weary. I know you're weary. We're all impacted by what we see. We all are constantly looking around. Where's the one thing we could do that would just stop this? But we don't have the luxury. I repeated what Omar Barghouti, co-founder of the BDS movement, had said to all of PSC's members at our AGM, where he said, you don't have the luxury of genocide fatigue. You don't have it, because we don't have it. So until you feel you've done everything you can do, you don't have the luxury of being weary. And that's part of, I think, how do you then sustain that? How do people keep going? Well, part of that is through the strength they gather from seeing other people there, which is why it matters. If we were holding these marches and 5,000 people were turning up, it wouldn't have that effect. So it is important that they are huge gatherings, both, as I say, for the visibility, but also so that the people themselves know, okay, I'm part of a strong and growing movement. And then the final dimension, which I don't want to over-exaggerate, but we know this is visible to people in Palestine because they tell us, you know. And that's what Carmen El-Boussi, one of PSC's patrons, the academic and activist, used to say to me, was Solidarity 101. She says, you know, the starting point is to give the message to the people who are oppressed that you're not alone, that we're standing with you. Then you look at, actually, what do you do that's meaningful, which is, you know, we are going to try to end all of the UK complicity that supports your oppression. But part of it is giving that message that says, look, there are huge numbers of people in this country who do not want to be standing where our government is standing, where our companies are standing, where our public bodies are standing, and want that to change. So all of those things, that's part of the answer as opposed to how do you keep going. You have to invest and believe in all of those things.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, I appreciate the sense of community thing. I mean, what I think people who try to crack down on the marches fail to understand is that by cracking down on it, they just reinforce community.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you were allowed suddenly to host a march outside the BBC, it would probably be massively attended, simply because they've made it forbidden in the first place.
Yeah. But one of the tricks there, one of the difficulties when you are facing repression is how much of your energy, because you have to, do you devote to fighting back against that?
Yep.
When people are arrested, how much of your energy do you devote to saying, let's all turn up at, when they're in court, campaign to have those charges dropped? You have to do that, but you have to get the balance, because if our fundamental energy is going into protect us, stop us being repressed, then it diverts our energy from why we're protesting. And that's a really difficult balance. And
it is.
And something we criticise for sometimes. Why are you not doing more about these people in jail and these people in jail? And it's not that we're ignoring it, but it's saying, yes, we have to defend all of that. And we do that a lot, including by going to institutions, cultural institutions at the moment who've banned performances or cancel events. We go and directly engage or organise protests to push back at that and say, you've got to stop doing this. And here, but at the same time, we cannot lose sight on what's the fundamental reason why we're doing this, what's happening on the ground.
Yeah. No, this is why I asked the question, to get that answer.
Okay.
all the complexities around it. Just kind of shifting the interview a bit now to your own story. You are half Palestinian.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that? I mean, I understand your father was an Anglican vicar from West Jerusalem. Your mother was visiting, and what happened? And how has that impacted you?
I mean, one part of the story, which I won't, because it's not unusual. I mean, my parents divorced when I was very, very young. And I grew up with my mother and got to know my father's sort of history through bits and pieces, through contact, and some of it much later in life, in terms of all the bits and pieces, including making connections with family members who were scattered across the globe. But the basic story, my father was an Anglican priest. He was from a place called Talbia in West Jerusalem, same area where he went to the same school where Edward Said grew up. And in 1948, he was in Nazareth. All of my extended family who were in Jerusalem were all forced out in 48. He was in Nazareth. And that was one of the few Palestinian towns and cities that was not fully depopulated. My father told me, and I believe this to be true, but I've never fully studied the history, that he was part of the leaders of the community that were involved in the negotiations to ensure that the Palestinians were not driven out of Nazareth. So he was still there in the 50s. He was still a priest, Anglican church in Nazareth, and he met my mum, who'd gone over to work in an orphanage in Nazareth that was attached to my father's church. So they got married and then he came over to settle in the UK. So I grew up here, and as I say, when I was very young, they separated. So I sort of grew up with my mother. And later in life really began to get a full understanding of all the bits and pieces of my family history. There's still lots of missing ingredients.
What sort of was it you prompted the interest because of interest in your family, which is natural, or did the Intifada play a role? Did news play a role?
I think it was a gradual process of, and in an odd way, I grew up with a sense of being Palestinian, but not rooted in a Palestinian community. I mean, I grew up in a very, very small town in the West Country, in Wiltshire. I used to speak with a very strong West Country accent, which I lost at some point. So sort of very disconnected with that side of my family. And it was really in my early 20s that I began to explore that. And then I had a broad interest in politics, but that developed into an interest that started with my identity. But I think in an awakening point for me, where I must have been, 19, was Israel's attack on Lebanon. And that was the first time growing up where I'd seen this really sort of dominating the news and beginning a process of asking questions about, well, who am I and what's my history, and wanting to explore that. And soon after that, I went to university and I began to sort of study Middle East politics as part of my degree. So it was a gradual sort of awakening and awareness. And then interestingly, I mean, I wasn't involved at the time, but PSC was established soon after that as well. That was a sort of motor for people to establish the sort of solidarity, organisation, PSC in the UK. So, yeah, that was the starting point.
Did you join the PSC from that moment or much later?
No, much later. And it was really, I think, at a point actually when I first began to get really actively involved. And it speaks to what I just said about what are some of the triggers for people. I came across a protest in Trafalgar Square. I think, trying to remember the time, I don't think I quite had my family, but I was about to start a family. I was young, but I thought I need to get actively involved. I need to do something. So that was the sort of trigger point. And then my route into activism was to set up a branch of PSC. So where I lived, there wasn't one. So I sort of established that branch and began to get active in the first place through my sort of local community, organising sort of protests in my area. And then started to get more involved nationally. And at some point, I can't remember how long ago, was invited to stand to be on PSC's executive committee. And that was my route to really this becoming, at the time I was a social worker, and then I was also, after that, ran a domestic violence charity. So this was always what I was filling all of my spare time with, running a branch and then becoming involved in the sort of national organising, until, I applied for the job as PSC director, which was like 8 years ago.
I'm guessing you've probably never been busier than you have been in the last 20 months, obviously.
No, yeah.
You don't have to get personal if you don't want to, but you can get as personal as you want to. How much of a toll has that taken on you personally, just from organising these massive protests and organising media responses around that, to actually witnessing the genocide? So what's that toll been like on yourself, on your family, everything?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer, and very early on in this process, I remember, maybe this is a long route into answering the question, but because this went in stages, and I was very conscious. October the 7th, we were on our way, I was taking a body of staff up to the Labour Party conference. So we always hold a fringe meeting in a stall at a Labour Party conference. I got the staff together, I think, on October the 8th, and said, every assault upon the solidarity movement that we've experienced before is going to come now triplicate. And our immediate job and our focus is to keep the roof up, because all of those who've sought to say PSC should be a prescribed organisation, to shut down all solidarity, are going to be on steroids right now, because we know what narrative is going to be articulated. Everything has just begun. Israel now has to defend itself from these monsters. And everyone is going to try and forget everything that's happened over the past, 75 years. And our job is to maintain that focus, maintain that reality, but keep the roof up. And then I said, very soon, but none of us anticipated the scale, But I said the Palestinian bodies are going to pile up. We know that. And when that happens, this will shift again, because people will start to see the reality, and we have to be ready to galvanize. And one of the things I said, this is we are going to be astonishingly busy. We're going to have to do way more. We already knew that part of that will be organising demonstrations. I didn't think we'd have this scale. Someone has said to me, do you think you'll still be marching 2 years? I would have said no. Partly because naively I would have said, if they're killing still killing after 2 years, the scale will be immense. The world isn't going to tolerate that. Well, you know. But I talked to the staff and said, we are going to have to look at how we deal with the impact of this as well, because we're going to see horrendous things and we're going to have to respond to them. The reality of being, I think you're not divorced from that. I think sometimes when you have that task that occupies your mind and your time, what can I do? How can I push to the limits everything that I can do? That's your way of dealing with the trauma, because you have a way of responding to it. But of course there are moments where if you're a human being, and where that's resonated most with me, I've had what I would describe as a great honor, but also shocking, accompanying Palestinians with family in Gaza who've lost 20, 30, 40 members of their family, into events, going in to brief MPs, sat by them as they've recounted what happened, how their family died, witnessed dehumanizing experiences. I remember one of them being asked, after he just detailed, I lost my brother, my sister, my aunt, etc., and being asked, were you close to any of them? As if Palestinians just have these relatives that don't really mean anything, you know. And seeing the extraordinary, it was, thinking, I don't know. And that's partly, I think, if the answer to the question, how do you keep going, how you deal with it, you look at examples of people like that who are saying, well, I'm going to keep going and I'm going to give testimony to their memory and I'm going to keep campaigning. But of course, I think for anybody in this moment, there are moments where, what I said earlier, you're going to feel weary. Of course it impacts. I've got a family. I've got a partner who has seen far less of me over the last 20 months. I was going to say than she ought to, but maybe it's a blessing. And I've got a staff team who I'm also conscious of their well-being, but at the same time needing to say we have to keep doing everything that we can. And everybody is very, very tired. But as I said earlier, we're also conscious, we don't have that luxury. So of course it's incredibly demanding. But I think, the honest answer of how do you deal with it is through action, through constantly looking at and reviewing, are we doing everything we can do? What are the other actions? And constantly looking at our strategy. And across the movement, there'll be all sorts of debates. What are the type of tactics and actions? But my fundamental view has always been that the only thing within our compass to affect change is to put every lever of pressure to change the policy of government, public bodies, to target complicit companies so that they stop their complicity. And that the lever you need to do that is a mass movement that that takes this across every aspect of society, so that in any corner you will see the cause of Palestine raised, so you start to shift public understanding and people are engaged. And you've got a movement that has this broad engagement of people that, using every lever of pressure. And within that, there should be room for all types of different tactics, but there's not one tactic that's going to work. Yes, we have to lobby MPs. Yes, we have to march. Yes, we have to have, boycott actions. And yes, there's a place for people to be taking, non-violent forms of direct action. You need all of those. And I would say that's the shape of what we've seen over the last 20 months. And it's not enough to stop this. But actually, if we're going back to what we began the conversation about, which is how do we understand some of the levers of pressure, you were right in what you put to me. It's a response to what's happening. Israel is responsible for this because its actions are utterly indefensible. But it also requires people who are shaping a narrative, who are able to provide a space to say, yeah, you know what, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are opposed to this and are doing something about it, and for people, if they're going into their town centre on a Saturday to do their shopping, are going to be confronted with people protesting about Palestine, so that their message is, right here in this town, this is an issue that resonates and matters, and there are people in my community who care about it. And there have been moments that have astonished me. You know, we see these large demonstrations. You know, I went down to speak to my branch in Dorchester, in Dorset. You know, Dorset's the English countryside. You know, they've had marches of up to 1,000 people. When I went to speak to them, a young student got up and spoke and was talking about it, saying, I said, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you explain? And she said, I'm talking about when we led the students out of the high school. I said, what do you mean? She said, 100 students marched out of the high school in protest and marched to the town centre.
Well, school students.
School students in a high school in a town in Dorset. So those sort of things. Now, you know that's not going to continue. You know, when this ends, we still have a job to do, because there will be a system of apartheid that still needs to be dismantled. But what is happening in this moment, I think there are things that are not going to be put back in the box. There's a whole body of students who are learning about politics and what it means to be active at the moment, where the plight of the Palestinian people is central to their learning. Where they are learning, if you care about values, if you're progressive, if you care about issues of rights and justice, then this is where you should stand on Palestine. And when you see that across all corners. You know, last summer, Glastonbury Festival, it's not a radical hotbed, you know, but what did we see there? We saw the fields filled with people carrying Palestine flags. So across every arena, it's like, this is where you should be sitting. And these are the things that are required to achieve, not just by themselves, but actually part of that process is normalising the narrative on this, saying, actually what this is about is a profound injustice, is a system of oppression rooted in an ideology that says, you know, this can be a supremacist state, an ethno-national state that gives rights to one people and not to another. And that's unacceptable. And therefore we have to take all the action we can to oppose it. So I don't know, I've lost the thread of your question, but so the answer of how do you keep going, it's tiring, etc., but it is having faith and in the belief that actually progress will come. You know, the old cliche that the arc of history bends towards progress, but only if people apply pressure on it, you know?
Yeah. You spoke about your own sort of part of your conscientization of what was happening was the need to understand your father and his family, etc. Yeah. In the last 20 months, what's your interaction been like with members of your family who are still in that part of the West Bank or West Jerusalem? And then also, I'm assuming you have your own kids?
Yeah.
And so how much of that sort of intergenerational solidarity sort of drives your actions?
Well, on the answer to the first question, I've got no family left in Palestine. So every member of the family was forced out in 48. I said my father was there till he was the last member, and my grandparents stayed with him.
So they moved outside of.
They've all.
They're all in the West.
They're all in the West or in other places in the Middle East.
Okay.
I have cousins in Lebanon, but one of those left Lebanon. Is now deciding, does he go back or does he stay away from Lebanon? So I've been in contact with them, but no family at all left. In relation to, I've got 2 children, and they are very actively involved. They've been on pretty much every single one of the demonstrations. They've been involved since they were very, very young. With, I think, first of all, probably the reality of, well, our dad goes and runs this, goes to the high street every Saturday with the stall. We'll go. It's a nice thing to do. But then, as they've grown up, a sort of deep awareness of what it has meant, and you know, a huge impact on them in the last 20 months, and a sort of sense of, I mean, it's made me reflect. I think when you're a father, in terms of what it means, you know, when I speak to Palestinians who've lost their children, if you're a father yourself, you understand it, but also that sense, you talked about the generational, and I've asked myself many times, you know, when will this end? You know, will my children have children? Will their children have to still be campaigning for an end to this? You know, I've got. I spoke about this at our demonstration on May the 17th. I got a picture on my wall at home of my two daughters, who are now, one's in her late 20s, one mid 20s, when they were something like 7 and 4, in Trafalgar Square with me, with placards saying "Stop starving the Palestinians," and it was a demonstration sometime after the blockade was imposed on Gaza, probably soon after. You remember it was declared that Israel was counting the calories at the time.
This was 2006.
Yeah. How much do we let in to keep them alive, but hungry? You remember the government spokesperson who said, "We won't starve them, but we'll
just give them enough.
We'll put them on a diet." And that resonated with me with where we are now, which was, you know, now actually we're seeing something far, far worse. You know, actually, no, we'll starve them. Actually, just starve them.
I mean, it's exceptionally. I don't think I've seen more dehumanizing live action figures in my. Never. It's unfathomable.
No. And so I'm looking at that's 20 odd years or so of my daughter's lives involved in campaigning for this. Do we have to wait till they're 40, 50, 60, their children, you know? So, yeah, that's, I don't know, those are my sort of reflections on those issues. Really.
No, we have just about two or three more sort of questions and then we'll be done. Gaza, it's been sort of the foundation of what we've spoken about, but we haven't actually spoken about it as such. We have mentioned that 10 months ago, or even maybe sooner, rolling back the devastation that Israel has created in Gaza would have been almost an impossible task, even if it stopped after 5 months. It's difficult now to fathom what a future of Gaza looks like. It must be. I don't think those who are in Gaza have even processed what has occurred to them. It's just survival. I don't think we have. I don't think people covering it. I don't think people in solidarity. I don't think people who are trying to destroy everything in Gaza, Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Netanyahu, have even sort of processed what's going on. It's just really, really difficult. And you mentioned now that, you know, what's this in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time? Will you still be marching for solidarity? What will be the situation? It's difficult to say what may happen, and we don't know. And many people did not expect what has unfolded. I didn't have any hopeful thoughts. Like, just FYI, I was like, this is going to be really bad. And it was very clear, I think, when Biden went and visited after the hospital was attacked, like 3 weeks on, that this was now going to be, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, this is going to be an abyss of destruction. But what do you think happens? I mean, how do you think the people in Gaza specifically, but also in the West Bank, and I think Palestinians everywhere in the diaspora, sort of heal from this?
Well, I mean, look, I'll tell you the first thought I've got there, because you're right, we are still in the midst of this. And almost your question is framed around this will end.
It may not end.
With Palestinians there who have to rebuild their lives. But, you know, there's something I've talked about and it's been on my mind in the past few months, of a speech I heard many years ago from, you know, previous Palestinian ambassador, Afif Safir, who said in a speech, don't presume in the inevitability of progress. we are struggling for our liberation. We believe we will be liberated. But there is another alternative future for us, which is we become the Native Americans of the Middle East. And when he said it, I remember thinking, because what he was talking about is Israel wishes
extinction.
to complete the job. He wants to extinguish us. They want to drive us out. They want to leave those who are left with no rights, no self-determination, underlings in Bantustans with no autonomy.
And then eventually build a museum.
But he was talking about the plan for the mass ethnic cleansing. And I remember, genuinely I thought at the time, I understand the sentiment, but do I believe that the systems of the rule of law are so fragile that the world would stand by in the 21st century and allow that to happen? And probably naively at the time I thought that's not possible. Still enough residual faith in there are limits to what people will tolerate. Who honestly could say now that a scenario in which all of the people in Gaza, that the gates to Israel, to Egypt are opened and people are forced out, or life is made what it is now so intolerable that they go or they are forced out, and that's not conceivable. And we are utterly confident that there would be the sort of intervention required to stop that happening. I don't think we can say that with confidence.
Yeah, it's true.
So that is something in terms of the fragility of the moment that speaks to the urgency of how do we, stop the possibility. Something Eric Cantona, I always quote him because he's my favourite footballer. He said, if Gaza is lost, humanity is lost. And he was talking about, I think, the centrality of what is happening to any system of order, to notion of rights being protected. But he was also speaking to, if Gaza is lost, that's a viable possibility in terms of the Palestinians not being there. But then, let's say this ends in a different way, that a ceasefire is enforced, that the bulk of the Palestinian population are there, then what's the project and the plan for Gaza to be rebuilt? Just on that level, how long does that take? And how do you deal with, what happens to the generation that's lived through the trauma? There's a horrible acronym at the moment that the UN's had to devise of, orphan child, no surviving relatives. The children have had every single member of their family. What happens to them? How do they grow up? How does a society build on and recover from the sort of the trauma of this and rebuild? So I don't know how we answer that, and in a way we can't until the urgency of the moment is making this stop. But politically we know that the task actually then is to say, look, everything that has created this situation, this fundamental system of a Jewish supremacist state that has not been held accountable and given impunity, has to end. But then when you do that, then you look at this fundamental task of how do you then build a free society in which Palestinians have all their rights built on the basis of this extraordinary trauma. And I don't know if there's easy answers to that. History tells us that this sort of trauma echoes down through the generations, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But this, I suppose my only answer to that is probably an unsatisfactory one. That right now that's not where our focus can be. That right now we have to end what's happening. What that does speak to is the sheer inadequacy of the sort of framework that is still being adopted. So even as our government rhetoric shifts and it still doesn't take action, what is it talking about? It's talking about nonsense about a two-state solution. It's not dealing with the reality of what is going to happen to rebuild that society, what is going to happen to end the fundamental dynamic that got us here. And another question, which for years what we've had, I remember sat in the office of the Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry with Haneen Zouabi, and Emily Thornberry losing her temper with me, saying, that's the third time you've said Israel. Stop saying Israel. Say the Israeli government. The problem is not Israel, is this particular government. And Haneen Zouabi, before I could speak, leapt in and said, no, you're wrong, he's right. Now, right now, we're looking at the roots of this problem in terms of a state founded on a pernicious ideology. Look at how that's resonating now. You saw the opinion poll last week. I mean, think about the implications of this. You know, 82% was it of Israelis saying they want all of the Palestinians driven out of Gaza. 56% saying all Palestinian citizens of the state should be ethnically cleansed, and 47% saying that they think Israel should slaughter everybody in cities that they occupy. Now, you're talking there about a sentiment across the public that is genocidal. How is that dealt with?
Yeah, I don't think such sentiment has been measured that is so extreme in modern societies. Like, we don't know what societies were like previous to this, but like, it's difficult to get your brain around that.
Yeah. And part of my answer to that is that type of sentiment is allowed to develop when a people are given a message there is absolute impunity for this. When you don't face the consequences of this, where you're not sanctioned, where you're not treated as a pariah state, where you're not forced to look at the consequences and say, actually, the world is not going to tolerate what you're doing. But if you get a message that actually we can go and slaughter as many of these people as we want, and the world...
It reinforces the idea that you are dealing with human animals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Of course it does. Because no system of apartheid and no genocide can be possible and supported across a society unless you've reached a mindset that says the people we are doing this to are not quite human. They're not like us. They could be treated like this. So you also have the fundamental question of how do you address all of that? You know, how do you deal with those attitudes? How do you fundamentally transform them? Because those people are going to remain in that space, and Palestinians are going to have to live alongside them in some shape or form. So how do you shift that? So these are going to be fundamental tasks, but the starting point is, you know, has to be that, you know, all of those who are complicit with this saying we have to shift this because all of our policies and our attitudes of support, of arming it, of having normal economic relations with it, of defending it, have led to where we've got to. You know, that's led to this moment where a genocide can be unfolded and live streamed to the world.
Okay, we've spoken about the sort of, I mean, to some extent, because it's hard to actually quantify this, but we've spoken about how devastating this has been. From the perspective of Palestinian solidarity, though, what's your sense now? And I mean, it's a difficult question because obviously there's a galvanized movement. Yeah. But how does that sort of counteract with the devastation on the ground? Would you say the Palestinian liberation movement on the whole, not the solidarity movement, is at a better point now? Because we've heard people like Mustafa Bruti say it is, and other commentators. I mean, Ilan Pape, for example, he says this a lot. Yeah. Do you agree with that sentiment, or when you quantify? I mean, it's a difficult thing, and it's just, and even the question itself, honestly, it's quite absurd.
Yeah, no,
right.
No.
But it's just from a perspective of, you know, it's trying to find a silver lining, if any.
Well, look, there is an element of, and I think everybody who's answered the question in a way, you know, Mustafa and Ilan are conscious of this. There's an element almost of grotesqueness when we say that the movement is strengthened. I'm the head of an organisation which has all the usual organisational imperatives. We have a sort of strategy, and it demands really for us to be able to maximise our ability to implement it, for us to grow, to become bigger. And all of that's happened in the last 20 months. You know, October 23, we had about 65 branches. We've got over 100 now. When I'm sending out emails to people, 65,000 people used to receive them. Now it's over 300,000. So when we ask people to do things, more people do it. We used to be able to get 10,000 people to write to MPs. Now 40, 50,000 people will respond and write to their MP. So if I'm sat here, you know, I'm not running a business. If I were running a business and I was giving an annual report, I'd be saying we're going through, you know, we are better equipped to do what we want to do. And the grotesqueness is, how have we arrived there? You know, so how can we say the solidarity movement is stronger where we're dealing with the most, darkest moment in the Palestinian struggle for liberation? And you and I have just had a conversation about, is it a feasible potentiality that there might be a mass ethnic cleansing? So that's the sort of horrible paradox. But across all of that, yeah, I do think, and look, we're also not naive, because there's been nothing like this. But if there are little moments in the past that have had some of the same dynamics, in other words, where Palestinians are being killed in huge numbers, which drives this to people's attention and gives them an understanding of the dynamics of oppression on a very basic, simple level, which is Israel is doing something appalling to the Palestinians. We've been there before in 2014, in 2021 to a lesser degree, and when that happens, we see growth in support. But this feels different. This feels like something that is fundamentally shifted. We'll see. I know, if this stops and I want to organise a march in a year's time and our screens have not been filled with starving Palestinians and Palestinians being slaughtered, will I get 1 million people out on the streets? Probably not. But will we be in a significant place in terms of the ability to galvanise, to mobilise, that is different than we were before October 23? Yes, I think we will be. We have more places now across the country, as I say, in terms of our branch network, who are campaigning on the ground. And I do think there's a generation growing up right now who are being politicised on this issue, that are learning things and seeing things you cannot put in the box. If you're trying to sustain current policies and using the frame that's been used, which is Israel's a liberal democracy, it's a good liberal state. It treats Palestinians well. It occasionally has to defend itself. And we're trying to say, no, there's something else going on here. This is a state built on a framework that dehumanises the Palestinian people, that says they have no rights, on an ideology that says only Jewish people have rights here. You want to convince people which narrative is correct. Well, the last 20 months have done a lot of work for us, haven't they? In terms of what people have seen, but not just in Gaza. The nature of the Israeli government now, look what's happening in the West Bank and its visibility. Look at the rhetoric that is no longer can be portrayed. Yes, there are people at the fringes of our society that say these appalling things, but they belong over there. No, they're at the heart of government. They're at the heart of government. They're all over Israeli television. They're naked in their intentions. They feel emboldened to be naked in their intentions. They're very happy to announce in the midst of this moment where Israel is isolated, we're going to have the biggest settlement expansion in the West Bank that we've had for decades. So all of that, if you believe ultimately in progress based on people having the right values, if they can be informed properly and galvanised to action, then you'll say the solidarity movement is in a stronger place. But God, this is not the way we wanted to get there, was it?
Final question. When everything that you sort of been through and that you've seen and that you've seen people respond to in the last 20 months, what have you learned, from yourself? What have you learned about the world? What have you learned in the last 20 months?
I think maybe this is a banal answer to it. Sounds like a cliche. But I've learned more about, I'm politically aware. I've studied history. We all know what is the capacity of the worst of humanity, but we've seen that viscerally. So I've learned something horrendous about a possibility that if you'd said this to me 20 months ago, that we'd have seen what we've seen, a live-stream genocide, and it would not lead to a fundamental shift in the UK government policy. I'm not sure I would have believed that. I remember very, very early on, I think 2 weeks after October the 7th, I saw somebody, a military analyst, being interviewed on Newsnight. And he was asked, how many Palestinians do you think will die before will be killed before we get to a ceasefire? And he did a sort of grotesque calculation. He said, well, you look at the rate of killing in 2014, you look at how long that lasted, and I think in these circumstances it will be longer than a month, probably at least 3 months, before Israel feels it's done enough to accept a ceasefire. Then I think we're talking about 20,000 Palestinians being killed. And I remember hearing that, thinking that's not possible. That scale of slaughter that we already knew was going to be broadcast, it's not going to be accepted. So I've learned something there. Don't underestimate the capacity for people in power to tolerate utter evil. I've also seen, we've also witnessed, this sounds like a cliche, the best of humanity, in terms of, it's a cliche to talk about the resilience of the Palestinian people. It's never been tested like now, and it is a cliche because, people are faced with awful choices. If you were in Gaza right now and you could get out, what would you do?
I'd leave.
But there is an image that will live long for me, which is when the ceasefire was called, people marching back to Gaza. They weren't idiots, into the north of Gaza. They weren't idiots. It wasn't like they thought, well, we know this ceasefire is definitively going to hold. But they were determined to go back and try to rebuild. I remember hearing somebody say, I'm going to go back and I'm going to search in the rubble for what's left of my children, and I'll give them a decent burial. So there is something you learn about the strength of the human spirit in the most extraordinary circumstances. And I've seen that within the Solidarity movement, with people's determination to give all of their energy to opposing this. That's the only thing that can sustain you. I mean, if you don't have still a residual faith in the basic decency of most people, if they can be galvanized, then you shouldn't be campaigning. We have to give up to despair. So I've sort of learned, I suppose, those things that might sound like sort of cliches, but they feel viscerally true as well. And I suppose on an individual level, you learn something about your capacity to, what you yourself can do in these moments as well, however tired you feel, because of an enduring faith in the justice of what you're doing, in the rightness of this cause, and that's just multiplied. I never had any doubt. But in the past 20 months, the simple answer to the question you put earlier, what keeps you going, is, well, what else should I be doing? What else should I be doing? I actually feel quite privileged to be in a position where I can have some direct impact on how we respond to this.
Ben Jamal, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.